The ghost of the duck shepherd. Lost justice revealed. Summary. In a desolate village shrouded in superstition and desperation, a chilling tale unfolds around Trévor, a struggling young man. Employed by the cold and ruthless Mr. Bale to herd ducks near a swamp, Trévor's life takes a terrifying turn. Unbeknownst to him, the swamp holds a dark secret, the restless spirit of a boy who had once worked for Bale and met a tragic end. Strange occurrences begin, from eerie wails in the night to the discovery of an old, mud-caked sandal. When the ghost confronts Trévor, demanding justice, the young man is thrust into a moral and supernatural battle. As he uncovers the truth about the boy's death, Trévor must summon his courage to confront Bale and expose his wrongdoings. The tale crescendos in a dramatic encounter, where the ghost's appearance shakes the village to its core. Haunted and transformed, Trévor becomes a symbol of courage, forcing the community to reckon with its buried past while lifting a lingering curse. Part 1. The Village's Curse. The village of Hollowmoor lay like a forgotten relic at the edge of a sprawling swamp. It was a place where shadows seemed to linger a little longer, where the air carried whispers of secrets too dark to be spoken aloud. The villagers, their faces weathered by years of toil and fear, lived under an unshakable pall, the curse tied to the swamp and its ancient banyan tree. The tree stood gnarled and defiant at the heart of the murky waters, its roots sprawling like claws reaching for the souls of the damned. Children were warned to never wander too close. Elders spoke in hushed tones of a boy, a mere shadow of humanity, whose restless spirit haunted the land. He was said to have been betrayed, exploited, and abandoned to a cruel fate by those he trusted. His name had been lost to time, replaced only by his anguished cries that echoed through the swamp on moonless nights. Stay away from the tree, parents would admonish. It's cursed, and so is anyone who defies its warning. Yet the curse was more than folklore, it was woven into the fabric of Hollowmoor. Livestock went missing, crops failed, and illnesses struck without warning. People whispered that the spirit's rage had seeped into the soil and water, corrupting everything it touched. Those who dared to dismiss the tales often found themselves plagued by misfortune. The stories grew darker with each retelling, the villagers' fear festering like an open wound. Trévor had heard the stories all his life. He had grown up in Hollowmoor, enduring the relentless poverty and the constant sense of dread that hung in the air. His mother, a stoic woman hardened by loss, had always dismissed the curse as nonsense. But even she avoided the swamp after sundown, her face tightening whenever the wails floated on the wind. It was on one such night, with the air heavy and still, that Trévor found himself staring out of the window of their crumbling cottage. The wails began softly, a mournful sound that seemed to rise from the depths of the earth itself. His skin prickled as the sound grew louder, more insistent, like a cry for help twisted by rage. His mother's voice broke the spell. "Close the window," she snapped, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "And pray the spirit doesn't notice us the next morning." The village square buzzed with unease. Another farmer had lost livestock during the night, their disappearance blamed on the ghostly boy. Some villagers whispered that the banyan tree's roots had grown deeper, encroaching on land that had once been fertile. Others claimed they had seen a figure, thin, pale, and dripping with swamp water, lurking near their homes. "It's getting worse," muttered old Mrs. Adel, her rheumy eyes darting nervously. "The spirit won't rest until someone pays for what was done to him, but who could face the spirit?" The villagers were trapped in a cycle of fear and inaction, too terrified to approach the swamp, yet unwilling to confront the truth. And so, the curse continued to tighten its grip on Hollowmoor. Trévor couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him like a second skin. He had always been curious, perhaps to a fault, and the tales of the ghost boy ignited a spark of both fear and fascination. What had really happened to him? Were the stories true, or were they just a way for the villagers to make sense of their misfortunes? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the swamp turned into a shadowy abyss, Trévor ventured closer to the banyan tree. He told himself it was curiosity, but deep down, he felt the pull of something greater and need to understand the source of the village's despair. The air grew colder as he approached, the swamp's foul stench mingling with the faint, metallic tang of blood. The banyan tree loomed ahead, its twisted branches reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. Trevor's breath hitched as he noticed something near the base of the tree, a bundle of rags and bones, barely discernible in the fading light. "Is this?" he began, his voice faltering. The wails started again, louder and more piercing than ever. They seemed to come from all directions, reverberating through his chest like the tolling of a funeral bell. His hands trembled as he took a step closer, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. And then he saw it. A pair of eyes, glowing faintly in the gloom, locked onto his. The figure emerged from the shadows, a boy no older than 12, his translucent skin glistening with swamp water. His clothes hung in tatters and his mouth open in a silent scream, blood trickling from the corners. Trévor stumbled backward, his heart pounding. The ghost didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, its sorrow and rage palpable. Words formed in Trévor's mind, not spoken aloud but etched into his consciousness like a brand. "Why won't they remember me?" the boy's voice echoed. "Why won't they make it right?" Before Trévor could respond, the figure dissolved into mist, leaving only the oppressive silence of the swamp. He staggered back to the village, his thoughts racing. The villagers had always feared the spirit, but what if they had misunderstood its purpose? What if it wasn't vengeance the boy sought, but acknowledgement? Justice? That night, Trévor lay awake, the ghost's sorrowful eyes haunting his thoughts. The village was caught in the grip of a curse, but perhaps it wasn't too late to break it. Perhaps, he thought, the truth was the key to setting the boy's spirit free. He just had to find the courage to uncover it. Part 2. Trévor's new job. Trévor woke to the sound of urgent knocking on the cottage door. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and shuffled to answer it, finding a wiry man with sharp features and a stern expression standing on the stoop. It was Mr. Bale's overseer, a figure known throughout Hollowmore for his cold efficiency and lack of patience. Trévor, the man began without preamble, his tone brusque. "Mr. Bale has work for you. It pays well, and it's steady. Report to the manor by sundown." The overseer's eyes lingered on Trévor for a moment, as if assessing whether the young man was capable of handling the task. Trévor nodded quickly, knowing better than to refuse an opportunity from the wealthiest man in the village, even if Bale's reputation for ruthlessness preceded him. When Trévor arrived at the imposing gates of Bale Manor later that day, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. The sprawling estate seemed to loom over him, its grandeur out of place amidst the crumbling cottages of Hollowmore. Inside, Mr. Bale greeted him with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Trévor," Bale said, his voice oily and smooth. "I need someone reliable to manage my duck herd out near the swamp. They're valuable creatures, you see, and they require constant supervision." Trévor hesitated, the mention of the swamp sending a chill down his spine. But the promise of steady work and the weight of his family's financial struggles left him little choice. He nodded. "I'll do it." Bale's smile widened slightly, his teeth gleaming in the dim light of the study. "Good. Report to the barn first thing tomorrow. Everything you need will be provided the following morning." Trévor set out for the barn, a modest structure perched at the edge of Bale's lands. The swamp stretched beyond it, a shadowy expanse that seemed to pulse with an ominous life of its own. As he approached, the acrid smell of stagnant water mingled with the earthy scent of hay, making his stomach churn. Inside the barn, an elderly caretaker named Amos greeted him. Amos's face was weathered and deeply lined, his eyes betraying a lifetime of toil and resignation. "So you're the new herder," Amos said, his voice gravelly. "Keep the flock together, make sure they're fed, and for the love of all that's holy, don't let them wander too close to the swamp." Trévor's brow furrowed. "Why not?" Amos's gaze darkened, and he leaned closer. "Because the swamp takes what it wants. Don't ask questions, boy. Just do as you're told." The warning settled heavily in Trévor's chest as he led the ducks toward the edge of the property later that day. The flock moved sluggishly, their webbed feet squelching in the mud. Trévor kept a close watch, his senses on high alert. The swamp's oppressive presence was palpable, its still water shimmering faintly in the midday sun. Hours passed uneventfully, but as the sun dipped lower in the sky, a strange unease began to creep over Trévor. The ducks, which had been foraging contentedly, suddenly huddled together, their heads darting nervously, as if sensing a predator. A low, keening wail drifted from the direction of the banyan tree, faint but unmistakable. Trévor froze. His heart thudded in his chest as he scanned the area, his eyes straining to pierce the swamp's thick shadows. The wail came again, louder this time, carrying a note of sorrow that made his skin crawl. He tightened his grip on the staff he'd brought, though it felt like little more than a fragile twig against the unknown. A movement at the edge of his vision drew his attention. Something pale and glistening emerged briefly from the water before disappearing again. Trevor's breath hitched, and he took an involuntary step back, nearly slipping in the mud. "It's nothing," he muttered to himself, though his voice lacked conviction. Just a trick of the light. The ducks, however, seemed unconvinced. They quacked nervously, their movements jerky and disorganized. Trévor decided to lead them back to the barn, his nerves fraying with each passing moment. As he hurried the flock along, the wailing faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that was somehow even worse. That night, Trévor lay awake in his small room at the edge of the barn, his mind racing. Amos's cryptic warning and the eerie events of the day replayed in his thoughts, each detail magnified by the darkness. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, lurking just beyond the edges of his perception. Sleep finally claimed him in the early hours, but his dreams were restless and fragmented. He saw the banyan tree, its gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers against a blood-red sky. A figure stood beneath it, pale and drenched, its eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. The boy's voice echoed in his mind, a plaintive whisper that seemed to pierce his very soul. "Why won't they remember me?" Trévor jolted awake, his heart racing. The room was dark and silent, save for the distant croak of frogs from the swamp. He ran a hand through his damp hair, trying to steady his breathing. The question lingered in his mind, a haunting refrain that refused to be silenced. As the days turned into weeks, Trévor's unease only grew. The swamp seemed to encroach further with each passing day, its murky waters lapping closer to the barn. The ducks became increasingly skittish, their behavior erratic and inexplicable. And always the wailing returned at night, a mournful sound that seemed to seep into his very bones. Despite his growing fear, Trévor couldn't bring himself to abandon the job. The money was too good, and the weight of his family's struggles pressed heavily on his shoulders. But deep down, he knew he was playing a dangerous game, one that would soon demand a reckoning. Little did he know, the swamp's secrets were beginning to stir, and the boy's restless spirit was far from finished with him. Part 3. First signs of trouble. The swamp's oppressive presence grew heavier with each passing day, its sinister grasp inching closer to Trévor's consciousness. At first, the signs were subtle, a whisper of unease that he could almost dismiss as imagination. But soon, the strange events began to escalate, tugging at the edges of reality and plunging him into a spiral of dread. It started with the ducks. Normally docile and predictable, the flock had grown increasingly erratic. They moved in disjointed patterns, their heads snapping at unseen threats. At night, they huddled together in tight clusters, their nervous quacking punctuating the oppressive silence. Trévor often found himself staring at them, wondering if they sensed something he couldn't. One particularly foggy morning, Trévor awoke to find several ducks missing. Their absence sent a ripple of anxiety through him. He searched the swamp's edge, his boots sinking into the damp, treacherous ground. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels. Near the banyan tree, he spotted something half buried in the mud. As he crouched to retrieve it, his stomach twisted. It was a small sandal, caked in muck and frayed at the edges. The size suggested it belonged to a child, and its presence near the swamp felt like an ominous sign. "What is this doing here?" Trévor muttered, turning it over in his hands. A chill crept down his spine as he stood, his gaze darting around the swamp's shadowy depths. The banyan tree's gnarled branches seemed to reach for him, their skeletal forms etched against the gray sky. That night, the wailing began again, more piercing and mournful than before. Trévor lay in his bed, the sound wrapping around him like a shroud. It rose and fell with a rhythmic cadence, as if it were calling to him. His body tensed with fear, but a perverse curiosity rooted him in place. The following day, Amos approached him with a grim expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the old caretaker said, his voice tinged with concern. "The swamp is starting to get to you, isn't it?" Trévor hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I found something by the banyan tree," he admitted finally, showing Amos the sandal. The caretaker's eyes widened, and he stepped back as if the object itself were cursed. "You should have left it where it was," Amos said, his voice low and urgent. "The swamp doesn't like to be disturbed. Whatever you've done, you've made it worse." "What do you mean?" Trévor demanded, frustration bubbling beneath his fear. "What's going on here?" Amos shook his head, his weathered face darkening. "The boy, his spirit is restless. He's been trying to warn us for years, but no one listens. If you're not careful, you'll end up like him." Trevor's chest tightened as Amos's words settled over him. The old man's warnings echoed in his mind as he returned to the barn, where the ducks were unusually silent. He knelt beside them, his hand brushing against the soft down of their feathers. They trembled beneath his touch, their fear palpable. That evening, as Trévor guided the flock back to their enclosure, a thick mist began to roll in from the swamp. The air grew colder, and the eerie stillness was broken only by the distant croak of frogs. The wailing started again, this time closer, more insistent. Trévor's heart pounded as he scanned the shadows, his grip tightening on the lantern he carried. Suddenly, a shadowy figure emerged from the mist, its form indistinct but undeniably human. Trévor froze, his breath caught in his throat. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, its sorrow and rage palpable. "Who are you?" Trévor whispered, his voice trembling. The figure's head tilted, and for a brief moment he thought he saw glowing eyes staring back at him. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the mist, leaving only the echo of the wailing behind. By the time Trévor reached the barn, his nerves were frayed. He slumped against the wall, his body trembling. He couldn't deny it any longer. The swamp was alive with something unnatural, something malevolent. The sandal, the missing ducks, the wailing, it all pointed to the same chilling conclusion: the ghost of the boy was real. In the days that followed, the strange occurrences continued to escalate. The ducks became increasingly erratic, refusing to leave their enclosure. The swamp's water seemed to inch closer each day, their surface rippling with an unnatural energy. Trévor began to notice fleeting shadows at the edges of his vision, always gone when he turned to look. Sleep eluded him, his dreams haunted by the boy's sorrowful cries. In one dream, he stood before the banyan tree, its roots writhing like living things. The boy stood beneath its branches, his translucent form shimmering in the dim light. "Help me," the boy's voice whispered, his words laced with desperation. "Make them remember." Trévor woke with a start, the boy's plea ringing in his ears. He knew he couldn't ignore the signs any longer. The swamp was calling to him, demanding his attention. Whatever dark secrets it held, Trévor realized he was now a part of them. And the deeper he delved, the harder it would be to escape. Part 4. The Ghost's Warning. The swamp was a place of heavy silence, broken only by the occasional croak of frogs or the soft rustle of unseen creatures. But as Trévor ventured deeper into its murky depths, the air seemed to grow colder, heavier, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The banyan tree loomed ahead, its twisted branches reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. It was here, Amos had warned him, that the boy's spirit lingered. Trévor's lantern cast a faint, flickering light over the uneven ground, illuminating the gnarled roots that snaked across the soil. He was searching for answers, though he wasn't entirely sure what questions he needed to ask. The strange events of the past weeks, the wailing, the erratic behavior of the ducks, the discovery of the mud-caked sandal, all pointed to something beyond his understanding. He needed to know the truth. As he neared the tree, a chill ran down his spine. The air felt charged, alive with an energy that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. He paused, his heart pounding, and scanned the shadows. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a flicker of something pale and fleeting. Then the wailing began. It was a sound that defied description. a mournful cry that seemed to rise from the very earth. It pierced the stillness, wrapping around Trévor like a shroud. His grip tightened on the lantern as he took another step forward. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. The only response was the wailing, louder now, more insistent. And then he saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim light cast by the lantern. It was a boy, no older than 12, his form pale and translucent. His clothes hung in tatters, and his skin glistened with swamp water. Blood trickled from the corners of his mouth, staining the front of his shirt. His eyes empty, void of pupils, locked onto Trévor, filling him with a cold dread. Trévor stumbled back, his breath caught in his throat. The boy raised a hand, pointing a finger at him, and for a moment the wailing ceased. When the boy spoke, his voice was not his own. It was a chorus of whispers, layered and dissonant, as though the swamp itself was speaking through him. "He betrayed me," the boy said, his gaze unwavering. "He left me to die. And now you serve him." Trévor's mind raced. "Who?" he managed to choke out. "Who betrayed you?" The boy's expression twisted into one of anguish. "Bale," he whispered, the name dripping with venom. "He took everything from me. My life, my name. He must pay." Trévor's knees felt weak as the weight of the boy's words settled over him. Mr. Bale, the wealthy landowner who had hired him, the man who held the village in the palm of his hand, was at the heart of this tragedy. The realization sent a shiver through him. "What do you want from me?" Trévor asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The boy stepped closer, his spectral form flickering like a flame in the wind. "Remember me," he said. "Speak my name. Tell them what he did. Make them see." Before Trévor could respond, the boy dissolved into mist, his form dissipating like smoke in the breeze. The oppressive silence of the swamp returned, but the air still felt charged, as though the boy's presence lingered just out of sight. Trévor stood frozen, his mind reeling. The boy's words echoed in his ears. He must pay. By the time Trévor returned to the barn, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. His hands trembled as he secured the lantern and slumped against the wall, his body exhausted but his mind racing. The boy's face, his empty eyes, his blood-stained mouth was burned into his memory. Amos found him there, his expression darkening as he took in Trévor's state. "You saw him, didn't you?" the old caretaker asked, his voice low. Trévor nodded. "He spoke to me. He said Bale. He said Bale betrayed him." Amos sighed, his shoulders sagging. "I tried to warn you," he said. "That boy, he's been haunting this swamp for years, waiting for someone to listen. But no one dares to cross Bale. The man's too powerful." "What happened to him?" Trévor asked. "Why is he like this?" Amos hesitated, then leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The boy worked for Bale, just like you. But Bale worked him to the bone, gave him nothing in return. When the boy tried to leave Bale..." Amos trailed off, his face grim. "Bale made sure he didn't. The swamp took him, and now it'll never let him go." The weight of Amos's words settled over Trévor like a leaden shroud. He thought of the boy's plea, his desperate demand for justice. Trévor knew he couldn't ignore it, but the thought of defying Bale filled him with dread. That night, the wailing returned, louder and more insistent than ever. Trévor lay awake, the boy's voice echoing in his mind. He must pay. The swamp's dark secrets were unraveling, and Trévor was caught in their grip. He knew that whatever lay ahead, he couldn't turn back. The boy's story demanded to be told, and Trévor was the only one who could tell it. Part 5. Peace in the mystery. The days following Trévor's encounter with the ghost were a blur of fear and determination. The boy's anguished plea reverberated in his mind. "Remember me. Tell them what he did." But who was the boy, and what exactly had been done to him? These questions gnawed at Trévor, leaving him restless and distracted. The swamp's secrets loomed larger than ever, demanding to be unearthed. It began with whispers, fragments of stories exchanged in hushed tones around the village. Trévor started visiting the market more often, listening closely to the chatter of the villagers. He approached the elder women who often sat together under the shade of the fig trees, chewing betel and recounting tales from their youth. When he mentioned the swamp and the banyan tree, their faces darkened. That boy, one of them muttered, shaking her head. He's been gone for years, but his cries never stopped. They say he worked for Bale, back when the manor was just being expanded. Another woman, her eyes clouded with cataracts, leaned in. A hard life it was. Bale had him running errands from sunrise to sunset, barely feeding him. When the boy's mother begged for his release, Bale laughed in her face. And then he disappeared. Trévor's chest tightened. "Do you know his name?" he asked. The women exchanged uneasy glances. "It's been so long," one of them said. "But I think his mother called him." Elias, the name struck Trévor like a bolt of lightning. It felt right, as though it carried the weight of truth. Elias. The boy's name was Elias. That evening, Trévor returned to the barn, his thoughts racing. Amos was there, tending to the ducks with his usual quiet efficiency. Trévor hesitated, then approached the old caretaker. "Amos, did you know a boy named Elias?" Amos froze, his hand hovering over a bucket of feed. Slowly he straightened and turned to face Trévor. His expression was grave. "I did," he said. "And I've spent years trying to forget what happened to him," Trévor pressed. "I need to know." Amos sighed heavily and gestured for Trévor to sit. "Elias was just a boy when Bale took him in," he began. "His family was poor, like most of us here. Bale promised his mother work and food in exchange for the boy's labor. But it wasn't work Bale gave him, it was slavery. The boy hauled bricks, carried water, ran errands. Bale pushed him harder and harder, and when Elias tried to rest, he'd beat him." Amos's voice trembled with anger as he continued. "One day, Elias tried to escape. He ran into the swamp, thinking he could hide there until nightfall. But Bale sent his men after him. They dragged him back and made an example of him." Trévor's stomach churned. "What do you mean they left him there?" Amos said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tied to the banyan tree. No food, no water. Just left him to die. And when he finally did, they buried the truth along with his body. But the swamp didn't forget, and neither did Elias." That night, Trévor stood at the edge of the swamp, staring at the banyan tree. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the moon cast long shadows over the water. He held the mud-caked sandal in his hand, the weight of it grounding him. This was the place where Elias had suffered, where his life had been stolen from him. "Elias," Trévor whispered, his voice trembling. "I know your name now. I know what happened to you. I'm sorry." The swamp stirred. The water rippled, and a cold wind rustled the leaves of the banyan tree. Slowly, a figure began to materialize beneath its branches. It was Elias, his spectral form pale and flickering. His empty eyes met Trévor's, and for a moment, the wailing stopped. "You remember me?" Elias said, his voice a mix of sorrow and gratitude. Trévor nodded. "I do. And I'll make sure everyone else does too." Elias's form wavered, as though he were struggling to stay present. "He has to pay," he said. "They all have to know what he did, they will," Trévor promised. "I'll tell them." The ghost of Elias began to fade, but not before a faint smile crossed his face. The wind died down, and the swamp fell silent once more. Trévor stood there for a long time, the weight of his promise settling over him. He had uncovered the truth, but the hardest part was yet to come. In the days that followed, Trévor began to piece together the full story of Elias's life and death. He spoke to more villagers, coaxing details from those who had been too afraid to speak before. Each fragment of the story painted a clearer picture of Bale's cruelty and the boy's suffering. Trévor also began to notice changes in the swamp. The air felt less oppressive, the water less murky. It was as if Elias's spirit, now remembered, was beginning to find peace. But Trévor knew that true justice had yet to be served. The villagers needed to hear the truth, and Bale needed to answer for his sins. As Trévor prepared to confront Bale, he felt a strange mix of fear and resolve. Elias's story had become his own, binding them together in a shared quest for justice. Whatever lay ahead, Trévor knew he couldn't turn back. The boy's name had been spoken, his memory reclaimed. Now, it was time to make the world remember. Part 6. The moral dilemma. For days, Trévor found himself consumed by the weight of his promise to Elias. The boy's anguished plea, "He has to pay," echoed relentlessly in his mind. Every shadow in the barn seemed to carry a whisper. Every creak of the floorboards a reminder of the spirit's restless presence. Yet with every step forward, Trévor was met with a growing fear that chilled him to the bone. He knew what exposing Bale would mean. The man was powerful, with influence that extended far beyond the borders of Hollowmore. Speaking against him would almost certainly cost Trévor his job, perhaps even his safety. Bale's reputation for cruelty wasn't confined to whispers about the past, it was alive in the present, etched in the fearful eyes of villagers who dared not challenge him. Trévor sat on the edge of his cot one sleepless night, staring at the mud-caked sandal he had retrieved from the swamp. It was a simple thing, fragile and worn, yet it carried the weight of a life cut short. He turned it over in his hands, his fingers tracing the edges as if searching for answers. Could he risk everything for justice? Could he stay silent, knowing Elias would never find peace? The next morning, Trévor sought out Amos, hoping the old caretaker might offer clarity. He found him near the barn, sorting feed for the ducks. The sun was just rising, casting long shadows across the ground. "You look troubled," Amos said, not looking up from his work. "I don't know what to do," Trévor admitted, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "If I speak out, Bale will ruin me. But if I stay silent," he trailed off, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Amos sighed, setting down the bucket he was holding. "You've seen what that boy went through," he said. "You've heard his story. If you stay silent, you're no better than the ones who turned their backs on him before." "And what about my family?" Trévor countered, his voice rising. "What happens to them when Bale decides I'm not worth keeping around? What happens when I can't put food on the table?" Amos's expression softened, and he placed a hand on Trévor's shoulder. "That's a choice only you can make, son. But remember, this fear is how men like Bale keep their power. If no one stands up to them, they'll keep getting away with it." That evening, as the swamp began to come alive with its nocturnal symphony, Trévor found himself drawn back to the banyan tree. The air was heavy with moisture, the ground soft beneath his boots. He carried a lantern, its flickering light casting long, ghostly shadows across the water. "Elias," he called, his voice trembling. "I don't know what to do," the swamp stirred in response. The water rippled, and a cold wind rustled the leaves. Slowly, Elias's spectral form began to take shape beneath the banyan tree. His translucent figure shimmered in the lantern's light, his empty eyes fixed on Trévor. "You promised," Elias said, his voice a mournful whisper. "You said you'd make them remember." Trévor's throat tightened. "I did. But what if I fail? What if Bale comes after me?" The boy's expression softened, and for a moment, his rage seemed to ebb. "I was afraid too," he said. "But I didn't have a choice." "You do." Tears stung Trévor's eyes as he looked at the boy. "It's not that simple," he whispered. "I'm not brave like you." Elias stepped closer, his form flickering. "You're," he said, "because you care. That's all it takes." The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and anxious deliberation. Trévor wrestled with the weight of his decision, his mind a battlefield of fear and conviction. He avoided Bale, unable to face the man without imagining the atrocities he had committed. Yet every time he considered walking away, Elias's face appeared in his mind, a silent reminder of the promise he had made. The villagers, too, seemed to sense a shift in Trévor. They watched him with wary eyes, their whispers growing louder as rumors of his encounter with the ghost spread. Some called him brave, others a fool. But one thing was certain: the swamp's secrets were no longer buried, and the truth was beginning to surface. On the eve of his decision, Trévor stood before a small gathering of villagers. He had asked them to meet him by the edge of the swamp, though he hadn't explained why. As they murmured among themselves, he took a deep breath, the weight of Elias's story pressing against his chest. I need to tell you something," he began, his voice shaky but resolute. "Something about Bale. About the boy who—" A sharp voice cut through the air. "What is the meaning of this?" The crowd parted, and Bale appeared, his imposing figure framed by the dim light of the lanterns. His expression was dark, his eyes sharp as daggers. Trévor's heart pounded, but he refused to back down. "The boy's name was Elias," he said, his voice steadying as he spoke. "And we all know what you did to him." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Bale's face darkened further. "Careful, boy," he growled. "You're treading dangerous ground. You're the one who should be careful," Trévor shot back. "Because the truth is coming out. Whether you like it or not." The tension was palpable as the villagers turned their eyes to Bale, their fear giving way to suspicion. For the first time, the cracks in his power were visible, and Trévor knew he had taken the first step toward justice. But the battle was far from over, and the path ahead was fraught with danger. As the crowd began to disperse, Trévor felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Amos, his expression a mix of pride and concern. "You did the right thing," the old caretaker said. "But be careful, son. Bale won't go down without a fight." Trévor nodded, his resolve hardening. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. Elias's memory demanded justice, and Trévor was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. Part 7. Confronting Mr. Bale. The morning was overcast, with heavy clouds hanging low over the village of Hollowmoor. The square, typically quiet in the early hours, began to stir as word spread Trévor was going to confront Mr. Bale. Few believed anyone would dare such a thing, and yet here they were, gathering under the watchful eyes of Bale's men, who loitered near the edges of the square with predatory alertness. Trévor stood at the center, his heart pounding in his chest. He clutched the mud-caked sandal in one hand, its weight a reminder of why he was doing this. Villagers clustered around, their faces a mix of curiosity and trepidation. Some murmured encouragement, while others whispered their doubts. "He'll ruin you," boy, an elderly man muttered, shaking his head. "Bale doesn't take kindly to accusations." Trévor's jaw tightened, his fear warring with his determination. The ghost of Elias haunted his thoughts, the boy's sorrowful eyes urging him forward. He took a deep breath and raised his voice. "Mr. Bale," he called, his voice echoing across the square. "I know what you did to Elias, and so do you." A hush fell over the crowd as the villagers turned their eyes toward the imposing figure striding toward them. Bale emerged from the shadows of his grand estate, flanked by two of his men. He was impeccably dressed, his expression calm but his eyes cold and calculating. "What is this nonsense?" Bale demanded, his voice smooth but laced with menace. "You've interrupted my morning with baseless accusations." Trévor stood his ground, gripping the sandal tightly. "Elias was just a boy. You worked him to death, and when he tried to escape, you left him to die in the swamp." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, their fear of Bale clashing with their growing suspicion. Bale's gaze sharpened, his lips curling into a sneer. "Do you have any proof of this wild tale?" he asked, his tone mocking. "Or are you simply trying to defame me out of jealousy?" Trévor stepped forward, holding up the sandal. "I found this by the banyan tree, where Elias's spirit lingers. He told me what you did. The swamp itself holds the truth of your crimes." Bale's composure faltered for a brief moment, his eyes flickering to the sandal before returning to Trévor. He laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent a shiver through the crowd. "The ramblings of a boy haunted by swamp tales," he said dismissively. "Do any of you truly believe this drivel?" A murmur spread through the villagers. Some shook their heads, unwilling to risk Bale's wrath, but others looked to Trévor with newfound respect. It was Amos who stepped forward, his weathered face set with quiet determination. "I believe him," the old caretaker said, his voice steady. "I was there when Elias worked for you. I saw the way you treated him, and I saw the fear in his eyes. The day he disappeared." Bale's expression darkened, and his men shifted uneasily. The tide of the crowd began to turn, their whispers growing louder. Trévor pressed on, emboldened by Amos's support. "How many others have suffered because of you?" he demanded. "How long have you ruled this village through fear and cruelty? It ends now. Elias deserves justice, and so do the rest of us." The villagers erupted into heated debate. Some voiced their agreement, emboldened by Trévor's bravery, while others cautioned against challenging Bale. The man himself remained silent, his face a mask of cold fury as he scanned the crowd. "Enough," Bale finally said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "You've said your piece, boy. But understand this defiance has consequences." Trévor met his gaze, his heart hammering in his chest. "So does cruelty," he said. The crowd began to disperse, but the tension lingered in the air. Bale retreated to his estate, his men trailing behind him like shadows. Trévor remained in the square, his knees threatening to buckle as the adrenaline wore off. Amos approached him, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "You did well, son," he said. "But this is just the beginning. Bale won't go down without a fight, I know," Trévor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But Elias deserves justice. And I won't stop until he gets it." As the sun set over Hollowmoor, the village buzzed with uneasy energy. Trévor's confrontation with Bale had cracked the veneer of the man's power, but the fight was far from over. Trévor knew he had made a powerful enemy, but he also knew he wasn't alone. The villagers' whispers carried a spark of hope, and the memory of Elias burned brighter than ever. The swamp seemed to hum with approval as Trévor returned to the barn, the sandal still clutched in his hand. He had taken the first step, and there was no turning back. The battle for justice had begun. Part 8. The Ghost's Revelation. The village square was eerily silent, the murmurs of the crowd fading into an uneasy hush as night descended. Shadows stretched long and dark under the flickering light of lanterns. Trévor stood near the center, his breath visible in the cold, damp air. The villagers, torn between fear and curiosity, clustered at the edges, their eyes darting between him and the imposing silhouette of Mr. Bale. Bale's expression was a mask of contempt, though his fingers twitched at his sides. His men loomed nearby, their presence a warning to anyone who dared to defy their employer. Trévor clenched the mud-caked sandal in his hand, its weight grounding him, reminding him of the boy who had suffered and died. "I told you already," Bale said, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "This is nothing but a child's tale. You embarrass yourself, boy, and insult this village with your lies." But before Trévor could respond, the air shifted. A chill swept through the square, extinguishing a few of the lanterns. The crowd gasped, shrinking back instinctively. The temperature plummeted, and an unnatural stillness fell over the village. And then it began. The faint sound of wailing rose on the wind, mournful and piercing. It seemed to emanate from all around, reverberating off the cobblestones and seeping into the marrow of those gathered. Bale froze, his sneer faltering as the wailing grew louder, closer. From the shadows of the square, beneath the flickering lantern light, a figure began to take form. Pale and translucent, it materialized slowly, like mist coalescing into something tangible. It was the boy Elias. His spectral figure shimmered faintly, his tattered clothes soaked and clinging to his frail frame. His empty eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, locking onto Bale with an intensity that sent a collective shiver through the crowd. Gasps erupted, and several villagers stumbled backward, crossing themselves or whispering prayers. Amos, standing nearest to Trévor, drew a sharp breath. "It's him," he whispered. "It's really him." Elias raised a hand, pointing directly at Bale. The wailing ceased, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to press against their ears. When the boy spoke, his voice was layered, a haunting chorus of sorrow and anger that reverberated through the square. "You took my life," Elias said, his gaze unwavering. "You took everything." Bale's face drained of color. He staggered back a step, his composure crumbling under the weight of the apparition before him. This is a trick," he stammered, his voice trembling. "It's not real. You're not real." Elias took a step forward, his form flickering but his presence undeniable. "I begged for mercy," he said, his voice rising. "You left me to die, tied to that tree, alone in the dark, while you laughed. And now, you will answer for it." The crowd recoiled as Elias's voice seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Bale fell to his knees, his bravado shattered. His hands shook as he raised them defensively. "It wasn't my fault," he cried. I didn't mean for it to happen." Elias's expression twisted with rage and sorrow, You lied, he said. You always lie. But they see you now. They know what you are. He turned his gaze to the villagers, his spectral form glowing brighter. You let it happen, he said, his voice heavy with accusation. You all knew, and you said nothing. You turned away. The villagers shifted uneasily, their shame palpable. A woman near the back of the crowd began to sob, her hands covering her face. Amos stepped forward, his voice shaking but resolute. We were afraid, he said. But you're right. We should have done something. We should have stopped him. Elias's gaze softened. And for a moment, the wailing wind stilled. It's not too late, he said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. Remember me. Speak my name. Do not let him do this again. Trévor stepped forward, his heart pounding. He met Elias's gaze and nodded. We'll make it right, he said. I promise. The boy's form began to waver, his edges blurring as the glow around him intensified. He turned back to Bale, who remained on his knees, trembling and pale. You cannot escape what you've done, Elias said. The swamp remembers. I remember. With those words, Elias faded, his form dissolving into the air. The chill lifted, and the square was silent once more, save for the sound of Bale's labored breathing. The villagers stood in stunned silence, the weight of what they had witnessed pressing down on them. Slowly, they began to turn their eyes to Bale, whose once commanding presence was now a crumpled shell of a man. His men, usually so loyal, exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or abandon him. Amos placed a hand on Trévor's shoulder. You did it, he said quietly. You brought him. Just as Trévor shook his head. Not yet, he said, his gaze fixed on Bale. But we will. As the villagers began to murmur among themselves, a sense of unity seemed to grow among them. They had seen the truth, undeniable and haunting, and it had shattered the fear that had held them captive for so long. Bale's power was crumbling, and with it, the hold he had over Hollowmore. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, Trévor felt a glimmer of hope. The memory of Elias would no longer be a silent ghost. It would be a rallying cry, a call for justice that could not be ignored. The swamp seemed to hum with approval as the crowd slowly dispersed, leaving Bale kneeling in the dirt, alone with his guilt. Trévor turned and walked away, the sandal still in his hand, its weight no longer a burden but a symbol of the justice yet to come. Part 9. Resolution and Redemption. The morning after the ghost revelation dawned with a brightness Hollowmore hadn't seen in years. The air felt lighter, as if the oppressive weight of the swamp had lifted with Elias's departure. But for Trévor, the events of the previous night lingered, etched into his mind like a scar. The memory of Elias's translucent form, his anguished cries still haunted him. Yet amidst the sorrow, there was also a quiet sense of relief. The boy had found peace. In the village square, the remnants of the confrontation were still evident. Bale's once imposing demeanor had crumbled. The man who had held the village in a grip of fear for decades now sat in his grand estate, a shadow of his former self. His servants had abandoned him, and his power was broken. Word had spread quickly about what had transpired, and the villagers who had once cowered in his presence now spoke openly of his sins. For Trévor, the days that followed were a whirlwind of emotion. He had faced the impossible, staring down both Bale's wrath and the ghost of a boy who had been wronged. And yet, he found himself grappling with an unfamiliar sensation: hope. The first step toward rebuilding Hollowmore came in the form of an impromptu gathering in the square. The villagers, emboldened by Trévor's courage and the undeniable presence of Elias's ghost, had come together to discuss their future. It was Amos who spoke first, his weathered face marked by determination. We've been living in fear for too long, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. Bale's power is gone. It's up to us now to decide what kind of village we want to be. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some spoke of repairing the old church, which had fallen into disrepair under Bale's neglect. Others suggested clearing the paths around the swamp, ensuring that Elias's story was never forgotten. Trévor listened quietly, his hands clasped tightly around the mud-caked sandal that had become a symbol of everything he had fought for. When Amos called on him to speak, he hesitated, unsure if his voice carried the weight needed to inspire change. But as he looked at the faces of his neighbors, he saw something he hadn't seen before: trust. He stepped forward, his voice trembling at first but growing stronger with each word. Elias deserved better, he said. He deserved to be remembered, to be honored. We can't change what happened to him, but we can make sure no one else suffers the way he did. The villagers nodded, their resolve solidifying. Plans were made to erect a memorial near the banyan tree, a place where Elias's story could be told, where his memory could guide them toward a better future. Trévor volunteered to oversee the project, pouring his heart into every detail. As the weeks turned into months, the village began to heal. The swamp, once a source of fear and dread, became a place of quiet reflection. The banyan tree, once a symbol of tragedy, now stood as a monument to resilience. Beneath its sprawling branches, a plaque was placed, engraved with Elias's name and the words "never forgotten." Bale's estate, abandoned and overgrown, became a cautionary tale. Children whispered stories of the man who had defied justice and lost everything, while their parents spoke openly of the lessons learned from his downfall. The fear that had gripped Hollowmore was replaced with a sense of unity, a shared understanding that their strength lay in standing together. Trévor found himself at the center of this transformation, though he often shied away from the attention. To him, the true hero was Elias, the boy who had suffered in silence but whose voice had finally been heard. Yet the villagers saw Trévor as a symbol of courage, a reminder that even the smallest acts of defiance could spark great change. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the swamp, Trévor stood alone beneath the banyan tree. The air was warm, the sounds of the village humming softly in the distance. He traced the engraved letters on the plaque with his fingers, his heart heavy but full. "Thank you," he whispered, his words carried away by the gentle breeze. He imagined Elias standing beside him, no longer a tormented spirit, but a boy at peace. Life in Hollowmore flourished in the years that followed. The villagers worked together to rebuild their homes, their trust in one another growing stronger with each passing day. Festivals were held in the square, laughter and music filling the air where once there had been only silence. Trévor, though changed by his experiences, found solace in the simple rhythms of life. He continued to care for the ducks, their presence a reminder of the work that had led him to the truth. He often visited the banyan tree, sharing stories of the village's progress with Elias, as if the boy were still listening. The swamp, too, seemed to change. The once murky waters grew clearer, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as if Elias's peace had extended to the land itself. Travelers passing through spoke of the swamp's beauty, its haunting history, adding to its mystique. For Trévor, the journey had been one of transformation. He had faced fear, wrestled with doubt, and emerged stronger. Though the weight of what he had seen and done would always remain with him, it was tempered by the knowledge that he had done what was right. As the village thrived, the memory of Elias lived on, woven into the fabric of Hollowmore's identity. His story became a beacon, a reminder of the importance of justice and the power of standing against oppression. And Trévor, the boy who had once been uncertain and afraid, found his place as a leader, a protector, and a keeper of the truth. And so, under the watchful gaze of the banyan tree and the endless sky, Hollowmore began anew, its people united by a shared past and a brighter future.